Part of the reason I'm so interested in this idea of the generous inference is that it was kind of a game changer for me in my personal life, my professional life, especially in debriefing or difficult conversations with colleagues. And the game changing quality of it was when I assumed the best of the other person, when this was my going in position, I was so much more relaxed. Welcome back to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. This week, we're going to be talking about the game changing quality of something I'll call the generous inference. And our readiness goal for you is heightening your ability to catch yourself making generous inferences. A few years ago, Laura Rock, Kate Morse, Joe Shapiro, and I collaborated with a unit in one of our local hospitals here who was really struggling with getting different role groups to work together well. And a word they themselves used was that their unit sometimes felt like it had had a bit of a toxic culture. And what Joe Shapiro and we talked about at that time was how do you move from kind of righteous indignation about what other people are doing to what we'll now call generous inferences about them. One of the things we did in that project was some interviews ahead of time to kind of get a sense of what was going on in the unit. And one of our interviewees, when asked about some of the other role groups, said, "Well, I wouldn't run them over in the parking lot." And by the end of our work together, the same colleague was saying, "Wow, I never knew that's what you were up against." And to me, this is a wonderful example of how we can have really sort of simmering hostility for even years. And when we do that thing of imagining what other people are thinking, or in the course of the work we did with them, a workshop where we excavated and discovered what were other people's goals when they were trying to get certain things done clinically. When those goals and needs and concerns were revealed, people felt like, yeah, of course you need to do that. And their very hostile inferences about the other people tended to shift to generous ones. Last week, we talked about the phenomenon of the psychological contract, an unspoken set of assumptions or unspoken set of promises between us that neither one of us necessarily even knows is there. This week, we're going to be thinking more like, hey, there's a promise that you made me. I think it's obvious. You didn't do it, but I'm going to assume the best of you anyway. So, one of the hallmarks of a generous inference, I think, is that someone else's action could be interpreted negatively, but instead you are going to interpret it neutrally or positively. At one end of the continuum, that could be called letting them off the hook, but we recognize the calming influence of a generous inference, particularly in the context where somebody's doing something that might otherwise trigger us. My colleagues, Laura Rock, Rebecca Meinhardt, and Ben Simon, published an article in Harvard Business Review a couple years ago on listening, and it reflected some of the wisdom of a workshop they had created on listening styles. The big dichotomy in listening that I learned from them is, are you listening to respond or are you listening to understand? And What the generous inference does for me is it relaxes my jaw, it softens my eyes, I lean back in my chair, and I listen to understand when I am assuming the best of the other person. So I think a generous inference, which is I assume there's a good reason that you did what you did, or a reason that I would consider legitimate, or a reason that a neutral third party might consider legitimate. Why that's so powerful is it shifts me from this guarded, protective stance and worry that there's a threat somehow in what you're doing to allowing myself the luxury of being curious and just listening to what's going on with you. So, a lot of the time, it's not easy to hold a generous inference at all. But one of my mentors, Diana McLean Smith, taught me something early in my career, learning to do consulting and teaching and dialogue with colleagues. And that was I can temporarily hold a generous inference. So she said, Jenny, you're trained in statistics. You know that there's a 5% chance that what this person is saying that seems like complete idiocy is actually right. You're familiar with confidence intervals. You're not always right. So, can you put 100% of your effort behind the 5% chance that what this person is saying really has a good reason behind it? And what I loved about this little trick that she taught me is that, boy, oh boy, there are times when I am certainly not holding a generous inference about someone else. I am assuming they are guilty before proven innocent. And this little moment of discipline just really helps me step into at least temporarily holding a generous inference about someone. And that sort of unlocks the moment. So, generous inferences, when we assume that somebody was late to a meeting because they got caught in traffic, or somebody lost their temper because they're having a very stressful time with their kids right now. Those kinds of generous inferences pop up all the time, just as our negative inferences do. But some generous inferences are more codified. And one of the ones that has become very important in the healthcare simulation world is called the basic assumption. And that is the idea that people are intelligent, care about doing their best, and want to improve is a formalized generous inference invented by my colleague Robert Simon. What's important about codified generous inferences, I think, like the basic assumption, is that it becomes sort of a cultural talisman. It's almost like this is how we do things around here, or this is how we aspire, at least, to do things around here. And therefore, I can check myself against that value and that generous inference, and I can try to keep bringing myself back to that. And the fact that the basic assumption is on hundreds of walls around health professions, education programs around the world, I think speaks to the fact that it somehow resonates so much with people. I sometimes ask myself, why does it resonate so much with people? And I think that's because so many of us are injured by the opposite, or were injured by the opposite, or even in some cases, experienced some trauma from people really judging us so harshly and assuming the worst about us. And this is like a little beacon of hope that, hey, we can hold generous inferences about each other and can do better with creating a context that is psychologically safe because I am assuming that others are assuming the best of me. So, in previous weeks, I've talked about some of the social psychology of how we make hostile inferences about each other. We tend to assume the worst about each other. But right now, I'd like to talk about what underlies allowing us to assume the best of each other. So, one of those things is a concept called the theory of mind, which is As we go from toddlerhood to childhood to adolescence to young adulthood, we start realizing that other people also have thoughts, other people also have concerns, not just us. And so part of what allows us to assume the best of each other is when we recognize that even if somebody's doing something that doesn't make sense to me, they cut me off in traffic or they cut me off on my bike, there might in fact be a reason, something going on with them that makes that make sense. The tricky thing is when we feel threatened or like we might be at risk in some way, our prefrontal cortex and our ability to imagine what other people are thinking constricts a bit. Well, our prefrontal cortex doesn't actually constrict, but our ability to use it constricts. And so we don't do as good a job of guessing or assuming or inferring that other people also have good reasons. So, part of what we want to do today in our exercise of the week is invite you to start strengthening your ability to notice when you are open and when you are holding generous inferences. So you could think of this week's workout of the week as almost the opposite of our first exercise when we did mental noting of our judgments. Instead, this week, we'd like to catch yourself making a generous inference and take a look at what permitted that. How were you feeling? What's your relationship with the other person? Was it something about them? Or is there something distinctive about the situation? We're kind of inviting you to both notice a generous inference and then explore it a little bit. What are the things that allowed it to flower? What are the things that allowed it to happen? I'd love to hear what this exercise is like for you. So feel free to email us at curiousnow@harvardmedsim.org. Message me or the Center for Medical Simulation on any of our social media platforms.